defines what an author should be. So they need to fulfill all these things. So first of all, they have to provide substantial contributions to the conception or design of the work or the acquisition, analysis, or interpretation of the data, and drafting the work or revising it critically for important intellectual content, and final approval of the version to be published, and agreement to be accountable for all aspects of the work. So it's not one of these things, it's all of these things. So if you're ever having arguments and someone's trying to push you to be a co-author, you say, well, did you do all of these things? And if not, you're not a co-author. Now I'm pretty generous, I think, in terms of I'd rather include people and give people the opportunity. Again, contribution is relative to opportunity, so people need to have, the opportunity. And as Charles mentions in the chat, that this also requires a signed document from the authors stating what their contributions were. And actually, we're moving now towards sort of the credit authorship taxonomy, which clearly defines what each person did on the paper, which is quite useful as well. Okay, so I use this paper as an example. It could be any paper, but I know this one because I was on it. So the first author, the person who does all the work, pretty much. The senior author is then the person who supervises this particular analysis. And then, second, third author, maybe other major contributors. Some people, and myself actually also kind of the second last author is maybe like a senior person who's supervised, but may not be the last. And so sometimes, when we're writing our summaries of like leadership, it'll be like I've, been second or second last author on X number of papers in addition. The other thing is that we've seen, oh, I went too far. The other thing that we've seen is that there's often now co-supervised, co-primary or co-senior author. So, and I think that's really important because it allows people, you can't ever say, well, that one person contributed, blah, blah, blah. But if two people are working on it, it allows for them to be jointly recognized. So joint first and joint senior is a great way to share around that contribution. All right. I just want to say, like, guys, it doesn't matter. I think I've got nearly 400 papers published now. And I say that more just to say that it's starting a paper. It doesn't matter how many papers you've written or you've been involved in, it's always hard. So you're not alone, and it's not easy starting to write a paper, but there's some ways to make it easier. So I was really fortunate. I learned to write papers from my mentors. Like I said, it was funny because my busy PhD supervisor, I was struggling. He oftentimes we would set meetings, and it was really hard to get him to like provide comments sometimes on my work. So I would schedule a meeting with him and sit with him as he was sort of reviewing my paper. But it was great because I actually learned a lot about writing because he's a really great writer as well. So I learned from doing, but also the STROBE, which is the for guidelines for strengthening the reporting of observational studies in epidemiology, as it says below, and the consort guidelines. These are like instruction manuals for how to write a paper. Like seriously, pull them, read them. It's the first place you should start when you start writing a paper. And it's so helpful. They're like instruction manuals for what you should do. And then you don't need to follow it exactly, but you should then tailor it to your own individual style. Okay. Okay, so for example, this just shows you like an excerpt out of the STROBE guideline. So the introduction section should describe why the study was done and what questions and hypotheses it addresses. It should allow others to understand the study's context and judge its potential contribution to current knowledge. So this is nice. It clearly explains what it is, and then it gives you some guidance. So background rationale, explain the scientific background and rationale for the investigation being reported. So, okay, so this is how it kind of looks. So how do I approach a paper? Well, I often break it into pieces. Oftentimes, I'll go back to a previous paper sometimes, and I'll start there and be like, "Oh, how did I do at that time?" And but the very first thing is start with the title page. Just get that bit done. Format it for your proposed journal, and then you've kind of like got one thing done at least. So you start there, and then start to write out the methods, even if it's not fully there. But that's like the methods is probably the easiest bit to write. Then what I do is I tend to work on the tables and the figures because that provides you with a blueprint for your results. That's your whole result section is is based on telling a story, and your figures and tables, you're kind of guiding your reader through this. So then you can write your results. I often think my personal opinion is that the introduction is the hardest piece to write. So I then do that after the results. And then I finish off with the discussion and the conclusion. That's the hardest part. So I'm sorry I took this one. This is an example, but I hope it's a complex topic, but I hope I picked this paper because I was actually really fortunate to have a bunch of fantastic colleagues who are really, really good writers, but also very succinct writers. So I think it's one of the clearest papers I've ever written because of my colleagues, and I was really fortunate to have them on board. So this is a paper from Hepatology back in 2014. It's helped to inform sort of guidance and clinical guidelines around treatment for Hep C. So it's the effects of female sex, viral genotype, and interleukin 28B genotype on spontaneous clearance of acute hepatitis C virus infection. So we're going to run through this, and I'll use this as an example to kind of, demonstrate a couple of points. First thing about the introduction, this is not an essay. This is not a whole history of hepatitis C and, everything that you need to know about it. You don't need to rehash the epidemiology of Hep C and the treat. It's all dependent on what your paper is, okay? So try to limit it to 3 to 4 paragraphs. And I've got a total cookie cutter formula for how I do this. So paragraph 1, why is this important? That is the key thing that you're trying to convey to the reader. If your reader does not understand why this topic is important that you're writing about after the first paragraph, you're in trouble, because they really need to know this. The other thing you're doing is placing the research in context, and by the end of this, the reader should know what are the clinical or policy implications of what it is that you're speaking about. All right. So I'm going to give you an example. So this is the first paragraph of this paper. Okay. So the first thing, although 20 to 40% of persons with acute hepatitis C infection demonstrate spontaneous clearance, the time course and predictors of clearance remain poorly understood. Bang. You know immediately as a reader that this paper is going to be about clearance, spontaneous clearance, and it tells you why. It doesn't go on and talk about how many people in the world are affected with hepatitis C, even though this is part of the topic. You know exactly what the paper is going to be about. Knowledge of clearance after acute HCV infection is limited because of the generally asymptomatic nature of initial infection and the highly marginalized nature of at-risk populations, such as people who inject drugs. Okay, this is why we don't know a lot about acute Hep C. This is kind of provides us with some context. And then the last sentence, understanding the time course and predictors of clearance provides insight into HCV pathogenesis and improves clinical decision-making regarding the need for early therapeutic intervention. So you know right then and there why this is important and how will understanding this, why have we not, generally known a lot about this, and we know, and it very succinct, 3 sentences, first paragraph. Okay, second paragraph. What is known about this topic? All right, so what are some key data from the area? You really want to set the scene. It's not a whole review of the literature, but it is in a way, but it needs to be succinct. The other thing that you're trying to say is what are the limitations in the work that has been done to date? And you're foreshadowing what gap is this research going to fill? Like, how is this advancing? Why is this novel? All right. Okay, let's go back to our little paragraph and I'll walk you through it. Okay, so what is known? Host factors such as female sex, immune responses, virus-specific neutral antibodies, and host genetics have been associated with clearance in prospective studies of acute hepatitis C. Okay, these are the host factors that we know that are important. The strongest host factor associated with clearance is polymorphisms in the interleukin 28B gene region, which encodes the interferon lambda 3 protein, okay, and is involved in viral control. Okay, so now we know, okay, the strongest host factor is this, and probably this paper is maybe going to talk about this because you're mentioning this. Individuals with non-favorable IL-10 interleukin 28B genotypes, and the specific allele, are less likely to clear HCV infection compared to those with favorable genotypes. Okay, so we know this is how this sort of host factor impacts it. Okay, then we say pathogen factors such as diversity of the viral HCV viral quasi-species, HCV genotype might also be linked with clearance. So okay, so there's some virus factors, but and then the gaps. So the majority of studies of people with acute HCV and clearance are limited by the small numbers of cases, which restrict statistical power, inference, and generalizability. Okay, bang, you already know. Here are the host and viral factors that are associated with clearance. And we know that this is what is, so you already know, you're foreshadowing this. This paper is likely going to talk about, well, what factors are important for spontaneous clearance of hepatitis C, right? Right. Okay. Paragraph number 3 is then you can, again, this is, oh, the other thing I just want to state, everyone, this is my way of doing things. It's not saying that it's the right way. It's not saying it's the only way. It's just this how I structure it. And I think if you look at the guidelines, there's some, in terms of the stroke guidelines, I think a lot of these are taken from there. But if you can have this is like there's some flexibility. You might have 4 paragraphs. If you need to introduce 2 topics, you may expand it a little bit. So just, I think take it with a bit of a grain of salt that, this is just how I like to structure things. It's not the only way. Okay, paragraph 3, study description and aims. I think this is helpful. So, okay, then describe the cohort. So this is the cohort. So the International Collaboration of Incident HIV and Hepatitis C and Injecting Cohorts, Inc. 3 study. A collaborative of pooled data from 9 prospective international cohorts, mainly following people who inject drugs, provides a unique opportunity to assess clearance in a large number of well-characterized HCV-infected participants with prospective follow-up. Then the aim. I think this is really critical. You need to state the aim of what it is that you're doing. So the aim of this study was to investigate time to and predictors of subsequent clearance subsequent to acute HCV infection. So okay, this is the cohort you're going to use, and then this is the aim of your study. So really important. Okay. Um, and just try to keep the introduction. Like maybe Carla will tell you something different in the social science section, and there's a bit more grace in social science to have a little bit longer of an introduction. But for like an EPI, public health, clinical paper, really try and keep it to 1 to 1.5 pages. If you see like oftentimes in the Lancet series sort of article journals, it's even shorter than that. Okay, methods and results. So methods follow whatever guidelines are appropriate for your study. There's lots of different ones depending on the type of study. So just look to see what study type you have. And then results is sort of personal preference. But remember, provides a guided tour of your tables and figures. Don't repeat the information in your tables and figures and mention any additional information that's not in the tables and figures, okay? Just a couple things about the tables and figures. Oftentimes, if you're doing sort of an epidemiological study, one of the some important things to think about is you want to describe your study sample. So you might do this in a couple of ways, but generally you'll have a figure which gives you a flow diagram of the participants enrolled, why certain people were excluded, and so on and so forth. Um, and that helps people understand what biases might be present in your study or how you think about interpreting the results. You also want to know the participant and characteristics and enrollment. So oftentimes that's a table that provides, basic information like gender, age, um, you know, various other bits and pieces, drug use. You then could key outcomes for the study, and that you could do that as a table or a figure, depends on how it fits. And then often you'll have, if you're doing an epidemiological study, what factors might be associated with your particular outcome of interest. So then you might have a table as well. And then, if you do subpopulation analyses, so let's just say your population is people with a history of injecting drug use, but then you really want to hone in on what was happening in people with injecting in the last month. Then you might do a specific sub-analysis in that population. But I think throughout this, remember you're telling a story. You're trying to bring your reader through and tell them a story of why you did, what you found, and why that's important, and how that sort of fills a gap in the literature. Just some other tips for tables, follow the journal guidelines exactly. Don't, I know some people like to like make it look fancy and bold things. The best thing is simple text, one font, check what font is allowed for that journal. Don't get too wild with, formatting because it's often prohibited by the journals. I personally don't like tables in the middle of a manuscript, and most journals actually don't want you to do that. So they should go at the end, have a new page break for each table, provide enough information so the reader can make calculations. They're not trying to make up stuff in their head, and just make sure that all the numbers add up in your table. You should be triple checking that. And then making sure that all the tables in your manuscript text match the order of the tables at the end of your paper, and just present everything that needs to be made to be able to interpret what you're asking or what you're working at. Okay. In terms of summarizing key findings, this is the discussion. So you're really summarizing the key findings here. So let's go to the discussion here. Okay. Again, this is my personal preference. A lot of people will say, oh, but you're just repeating stuff. Sometimes somebody's going to pick up your paper and just read the discussion or the first paragraph of your discussion to find out what you did. So help the reader, okay? Re-summarize. So this study describes the time course and independent predictors of spontaneous clearance in a large sample of participants with well-defined acute HCV infection, the majority of whom were people who inject drugs. So again, almost restating your objective, but put in terms of what you found, okay? I think everybody would agree that this is pretty clear. It doesn't matter what area you're working in. This is a pretty clear, what we were doing here is clear. And to be honest, short sentences are often best. Look, the proportion with clearance at 1 year was 25%. That's really clear. And then among those with clearance, the median time to clearance was 16.5 weeks, with 2/3 clearing within the first 6 months of infection. And this is kind of starting to these are your key findings, okay? So the first sentence is your main aim or the key main aim finding. Then you and what this does, this allows you to set up your paragraphs to follow. So what I'm going to tell you is, so the proportion with clearance at 1 year was 25%. That's an important key finding. There should be then a paragraph that corresponds to that key finding. And I'll talk about that in a sec. So among those with clearance, median time to clearance was 16.5 weeks. Independent predictors of clearance included female sex, favorable IL-28B genotype, and HCV genotype 1 infection. So we know that that's why. The effect of both IL-28B genotype and HCV genotype on clearance tended to be greater in females compared to males. So there's your key finding. And then what are the implications? So this study provides important insights into factors affecting HCV viral control and offers guidance in clinical decision-making for treatment of acute HCV infection. Through this whole set, okay, what did they do? What did they find? And why is this important? And how is it going to impact clinical practice? So again, I think it's a really nice formula. And then you think about your subsequent paragraphs. For each key finding, how do the results compare with the literature in this area? If it's similar, what do these results add beyond what was known before? If it's different, why are the results different? And then provide an explanation for why it is you found what you did. And if it's different, why? If it's the same, why? So this is the first paragraph or the second paragraph of the discussion. Okay, so the overall proportion with spontaneous clearance of 25% at 1 year is consistent with a weighted mean clearance of 26% reported in a systematic review of a prospective acute HCV studies. Okay, so it's the same. Good. Well, why is that important? So confirmation of this estimate is important. And this is what does the study add? So confirmation of this estimate is important given that the systematic review by Micallef et al. Was limited by heterogeneity, so differences or wide variation of studies in terms of sample size, inclusion criteria, and follow-up. The large sample size, well-defined population, and frequent follow-up within the INC3 study provide a more precise estimate of the rate of clearance among people with acute HCV infection. So this is what the benefits were, and this is why it sort of extended things. All right. So we've said that. So for each of the key findings, so limitations. So each of these paragraphs, then you're focusing on a key finding and you're doing the same formula. Then you need a limitation section. So what biases or limitations may have impacted your results? So if you recruited from a hospital-based sample, is it that group of people might potentially have been more sick? How might that have impacted what you found? So you need this limitation section. Again, the Strobe guidelines provides a really good way to do that. And then what are the policy, and you need a paragraph then on what are the policy or practice implications of this work. That's really important as well. Okay, I'm going to hand over. We've decided we're going to tag team and go back and forth. So I'll hand over to Carla to provide some insights around social science papers. So yeah, Carla, over to you.
Thanks very much, Jason, and hello, everybody. Lovely to be here. So I'm a primarily qualitative social scientist working at the University of New South Wales in Sydney, and I've been publishing since last century, so got a bit of experience to draw on. But every paper is different, particularly in a social science qualitative world. There aren't so many well-used formulas that, as Jason has spoken to, there's an opportunity perhaps to be a bit more creative, but there are some key things that you need to talk about, you need to provide in a paper. And some of the things that Jason has said absolutely hold for qualitative research methods. I'm going to talk particularly about the use of theory and give an example of a paper and talk through the various components of it. So using a theory is really important for qualitative work. It elevates your work to places and to better journals, more impact than a purely descriptive paper. So I've given some examples of other papers to draw on in these slides. So some authors talk about a theory as a golden thread that holds together your central argument of the paper. It's these key ideas that flow through what you're going to present in the literature review, in the conceptual framework, in your questions, the methods, analysis, how you organize the data, and what conclusions you draw, this golden thread of coherence. I'm just going to ask everyone to mute, if that's okay. A theory gives you the opportunity to use multiple lenses to consider complex social phenomena. What we're all interested in is complex social phenomena. And we need some guidance to how to think through this complexity. So there's a part about paradigms. How do you know what you know? What that might be the way that you what you include in your paper, and then also theory to move beyond description. So to give you a bit more on this idea, try to sell you on the idea of using theory if you're not already. A theory is a big idea that organizes many other ideas with a high degree of explanatory power. They can provide these complex and comprehensive conceptual understandings. Particularly, I'm really excited about using theory to look beneath the visible surface. What is it that's there that's related to issues of power or gender or colonization? How can we use the great thinking other people have done to make our work even more interesting and impactful? So we want to understand how societies work, how organizations operate, and why people interact in certain ways. So theories distill research into a statement about social life that holds transferable applications to other settings, contexts, populations, and time periods. And I think that's really important to differentiate descriptive work. So you might be able to do a qualitative paper that says, why are the reasons why people engage with this model of care that we've set up in this particular way. Yep, that's interesting, but that's really bounded to that particular time period, that particular population, that particular context of that care model. Using a theory, I'm going to show you one about acceptability in a moment, means that you can use that theory of acceptability to explore your care model in relation to others that have also examined what's acceptable about different care models, and draw your work into this bigger literature that has a greater story to tell. Very transactionally, using a theory will get your papers into better journals. So this is an editorial that was written in 2013, so more than a decade ago, but the points here still hold very true. So this was in the journal Addiction. Joe Neal was the senior editor there. I was an associate editor at that time. And together as a team with other people, we said, these are the reasons why we want authors submitting to addiction to use theory. And these highlighted bits here that highlighted particular shortcomings, the lack of clarity regarding core concepts and descriptive analyses that lack depth, nuance, or appropriate engagement with theory or relevant concepts. So this editorial is literally telling people, use some theory, use some ideas, and your paper will have a better chance of being well received in our journal. And the same would be true with now running with Jason, the International Journal of Drug Policy. So let's look at a paper, a qualitative paper that uses an example, uses a theory of acceptability. So again, I've chosen one that I'm an author on and Jason happens to be as well, and led by Lee Slafferty. And this is about point of care hepatitis C testing in prison and patient perceptions of acceptability of that. Still getting a bit of feedback from people who are muted. Can I ask people to mute their microphones, please? So acceptability is a big word. There's lots of different ways that people could talk about, give their own definitions of acceptability. So that's not great. We need to understand what it is that we're talking about when we try to examine acceptability, as we need to know what we're talking about when we're examining point of care tests or what a prison is in this context. We need a good, tight definition of the key concepts. So here is how you can indicate in the abstract that you are using concepts, ideas to shape your data collection and analysis and interpretation. So like Jason's presented in his examples, yes, an abstract, it has an introduction. We're interested in diagnostic pathways. We're interested in the prison setting. And we're going to be using the PIVOT study, which is a one-stop intervention in prison to examine patient acceptability of this point of care Hep C RNA testing. Moving on to the methods in the abstract, this is where we, as an editor or a reviewer or an examiner of your thesis, I want to see that you've got some ideas, concepts that are informing your thinking. So we get to see a little bit about the sample. There's 24 men. They were purposefully selected. This is how we came to have them in the study. And this last sentence of the methods of the abstract says, and we're going to be using this theoretical framework of acceptability, which has 7 components. Oops. Someone bumping the slides there. I'm going to take them back. Too far. Okay. Oh my gosh, keeps jumping around. All right, so in the introduction of the paper, as Jason mentioned, now the slides have disappeared. I'll come back in a minute. As Jason mentioned, qualitative papers might arrange themselves differently to quantitative papers, and we need to be able to say somewhere what theory we've chosen, what ideas we've chosen to explore, and why. So in this paper of Lisa's, we start with this great sentence: evaluation of healthcare interventions often fail to adequately define acceptability, because there's lots of different ways that people could think and talk about acceptability. So these authors have developed this theoretical framework of acceptability. It's got 7 components, and here's a list of them. So this paper explores acceptability and perceptions of fingerstick point of care testing in the population that we're interested in. So we've got a gap of our knowledge because people just throw around this word of acceptability. We've landed this with a theory. This is what we're going to talk about. And it's got 7 components. Next, I'm looking for, as an editor, as a reviewer, as an examiner, a bit in your methods about how that theory came to life. So for qualitative papers, The first sentence is very standard. If you're doing interviews, you've got to talk about how the data was managed. The interviews were audio recorded, they were transcribed verbatim, proof for accuracy, and de-identified. Very standard sentence. Then a software program, in this case NVivo, was used to manage the data. And there was a coding framework that a range of authors developed following the interview guide. There was first round of coding that used both inductive and deductive, using this framework, this 7-component framework of acceptability, and other themes like timing preferences. So it became, next bit, it became apparent during initial coding that some of the definitions of acceptability would need to be reinterpreted for the context of the data. And there's an example of how self-efficacy is how that manifests in this particular population and setting. And then a second round of coding was undertaken to ensure the interpretation of data within these sub-themes. That is such an essential paragraph towards the end of your methods that I want to see how you are bringing these ideas to life. How were they put literally to work in your analysis and interpretation? So then presenting these data in the results. Just waiting for the slides to respond to the button. So in the results, here is a snip from the results. And the results section is organised in this paper under each of those 7 headings, not quite 7 because some weren't quite apparent in the data, different sections of the acceptability framework. So here's the first one, burden. The definition at the first sentence, burden encompasses the perceived amount of effort that is required to participate in the intervention. And then following that is a bit of explanation of how burden manifested for this particular population group in this particular setting, and then some quotes to illustrate those aspects of burden in relation to acceptability. In the second section of the results, Lisa's outlined self-efficacy. Again, here's the definition of self-efficacy, refers to the participant's confidence that they can perform the behaviours required to participate in the intervention. Fantastic. It's setting us up to understand what self-efficacy is in this theory, and then a bit of analysis, the written analysis to say, how does this play out in this population group in this setting? And some quotes both embedded in that text and presented below the paragraph to illustrate this notion of self-efficacy from the interview transcripts. And the results proceeded like that. Skipping forward to the discussion, again, as Jason mentioned, that first paragraph to say, here's the summary, and then which says acceptability was really important. The second paragraph then goes on to talk about which particular parts of acceptability were important, and a brief summary of how they were important. In this paper as well, not all of the 7 parts of acceptability were observed. So here's a nice paragraph in the discussion to say ethicality didn't appear. And again, a bit of definition of what that means, some contextualizing around stigma from health workers towards people who inject drugs, and some notions to explain this aspect of ethicality in relation to this particular technology in this setting with this population. And to get to the conclusion, we need to wrap up these ideas. So remember, it's about point of care, fingerstick RNA testing in prisons, and what is it about acceptability that's going to help us think about policies or practices around this technology in this setting. So Lise here wraps up that issues of psychological burden were important. A few other elements tried to wrap up this story, this golden thread, and bring it all together in a conclusion paragraph. Going to hand back to Jason for the next component. Over to you.
Great. Thanks so much, Carla. All right.
So I'm
So,
just, have you still got control, Jason?
yeah,
Okay, excellent.
great. So now we're going to get to the submission of a paper, what to consider. So I think first thing is you need to decide, are you going to go to New England Journal of Medicine? You going to go to the Lancet? Are you going to go to a more disease-specific journal? I think it's really important. And look, I think a couple key things. The first thing is I think you have to be realistic about the impact of your work. You don't want to be submitting it to a super high impact journal if it's not really that way. And so I think be clear, is the work that you're doing general or is it very discipline specific? Um, and look, maybe you might care about what the impact factor of the journal is, but maybe that's not such a big deal. So I think be realistic. And, I think if I think about my own sort of background, oh, that's the other thing, aim high. I think, you want to do things realistically, but you do want to aim for the best you can get. And I know it's a bit, I don't mean to come across badly, but sometimes if you get something accepted on the first go, you're like, oh, should I have maybe gone like a touch higher? But I think, within reason. Um, okay, submitting a paper, obtaining feedback from co-authors. So the first thing is to send your paper to the senior author for review. Um, it's really important. So you have to, you really need the senior author to be the first one to see it. There's nothing worse than a paper going out when the senior author hasn't looked at it. Just one thing, I think when there's multiple of us on the slides, I don't think anybody can be doing anything on their computers because I think that's what's happening. So I think just Brooke and Carla and Andrew, I'm sorry, because I think it just is impacting the slide progression. Okay. So then you send to your other co-authors. Consider alternative ways of engaging people. So not everybody likes to comment on some paper or some Word document. And this doesn't matter if it's people from the affected community or clinicians. Everybody's busy and not everybody engages that way. So we've done things like have Zoom or Teams calls where we go through the data, present the data, get people's feedbacks as an alternative way to people commenting on a paper. So that works really well. And I think also give people plenty of notice to review. I generally aim for 3 weeks to give you've worked on this for quite a long time. I think give your authors a lot of time as well because yes, you've been working on this and you've been pouring your head over, but you've been spending months and months on this. They only get 3 weeks. So don't be like, oh, you've hit the because you've been through this pain of doing this, then all of a sudden you give people like a week. Yes, you've been working on a long time, but everybody else necessarily might not have. And just make sure that your co-authors check and confirm the names and affiliations. It's really, I know it seems like a small thing, but just that's really important so that you don't have misspelt surnames or first names and make sure the middle initial is included. And the other thing is make sure that if your research has been funded and just don't forget that sometimes this is in your contract with the funder, the number of times and they want the certain wording. So you just check the contract. And also, like, for example, we have the Aboriginal Health and Medical Research Council here in Australia that we often have approved, and we need to send our papers to them before we submit it. And there's nothing worse than having to go back and say, oh, shoot, we just got this paper accepted and we forgot to send it to you. They'll accept it once, but they'll get pretty annoyed if you're doing that a lot. So just a couple of things to consider at submission time. You often need a letter to the editor, and I've changed my views on this. Carla and I have had many a discussion about this, and I used to think it was really important. But now, as I'm handling hundreds of papers a year, I very rarely look at the letter to editor anymore, or you're busy. If so I tend to read the abstract. Oftentimes that's a repeat of the letter. A good letter to the editor kind of outlines the key findings, the novelty of the work, and the significance for the field. So I would generally I tell my students to generally like, copy and paste from the discussion and then sort of rephrase it. Just in terms of choosing reviewers, it's becoming less essential. And actually, our journal has stopped allowing this because people just suggest their friends. So I used to say take the time to search PubMed. If you do have the option, and some places still do, so you then do take the time. Don't pick your friends. Just think about people who've published similar work, and then maybe select postdocs or more junior academics because the more senior people aren't going to often say yes. And just be prepared for rejection. I think my first paper, I think I submitted to 7 different journals before it got accepted. So, and it just, you keep going down and sometimes you can even go back up. And I've had times where we've submitted one place, it's been rejected. I've gone to a higher impact journal and it's got up. So it's a bit of a crapshoot in terms of who you get for reviewers and editors. And so it's not a science, but it is going to take, it takes a couple times. So just, be prepared. Um, I just find this comics quite funny. So it is a negotiation responding to reviewers. And I think that these 5 stages of peer review, denial, anger, bargaining, depression, acceptance, it's a bit funny, but I think you should take some bits on board. You don't have to do everything. I think you have to give and take a little bit. So you need to make sure you address the really important stuff. Not an editor hates it, nothing, and a reviewer hates anything more than to like get something and then the authors have either they're condescending in their response to the comments or they're passive aggressive with the tone or they just completely ignore it. If you want to get a rejection post review, that's a good way to do it. So just be really mindful. Just in terms of the proofs, a couple other things, just really critical to review all your numbers and figures and your tables. Again, check the names of the authors, including making sure middle initials are there and making sure the affiliations are right. Check the address and your affiliation. Check that the funding is correct. Don't forget other people's grant numbers and any disclaimers that are there. And just make sure you send to the senior author. I would say that I don't think I ever review a paper as a sort of senior author that I don't pick up at least one thing on the proofs that we just forgot about. So you should always, always, always send to the senior author for final review. Okay, just some final reflections before handing it back to Carla for a couple more points and then to Andrew and then some questions. Just plan ahead. I hope that if you could just take away anything, plan ahead because a little bit of work up front will save you lots of pain down the road and, including on sort of the concept sheet kind of concept. Break your paper writing into pieces, and I think things will start to fall into place. I think just get it slowly going, and you'll feel like you're making progress. The little things do matter. Please, please, please pay attention to detail. There's nothing more frustrating than fonts that are different sizes, fonts that are different styles. If a reviewer sees this or an editor, they're going to be like, if they didn't take the time and attention to make those things matter, then I just wonder what their research is like and what this means for the rest of the work. So, and just don't get discouraged. All right. So I think that's it for me. I'll hand back to Carla. She's going to talk a little bit about language.
Yeah, definitely don't get discouraged. I'm doing some response to reviewers' comments tonight. Never ends. If you choose this career, this is what you're going to be doing. So language, I really wanted to just spend a couple of minutes, perhaps for this audience, don't need to say this out loud, but it's important to do it anyway. And I'm drawing on a couple of papers, which are in the slide set, and you can go and have a look, because as authors in the field, no matter where we come from, we are actively creating the field ourselves through our writing. So I'm drawing on this paper from Kate Sear and colleagues that's to say that when we research and when we write, we are making the realities and intervening in worlds. We're not just there to document it as an objective, in quotation marks, observer. The language choices that we make, the ways that we express things, And in fact, the writing teams that we put together are all constituting the field that we are working in and living in. So a few, again, maybe don't need to say this for this audience, but why do we worry particularly about drug stigma in research and in academic writing? And there are some really important lessons of history to understand that since the early 1960s, there have been international treaties to which most countries are signatories that have prohibited the use, possession and supply of drugs, and used these terms of referring to drugs as a serious evil. The work of Kate Sear has positioned this as exceptional terminology that's not used in any other international conventions, including those on things such as genocide. So that language sets the stage for just about all of our countries to understand how drugs are written about in law, and then the trickle of that into the rest of our societies, including ourselves as researchers, practitioners, and all the other identities that we pick up. It takes some work to unpack, repeal that kind of deep societal conditioning of seeing drugs as framed as evil and the long-standing criminalisation that goes along with that framing. So some references there if you are interested in reading some more. But this is why we worry so much and we pay so much attention to the language that's used in research and in academic writing about drugs and people who use them. But it's not just our field. There are heaps of other fields that are also looking very carefully at their choice of language and expression. So one that was just published this month or last month in Nature Medicine about the People First Liver Charter, related to hepatitis, of course, but broader than just hepatitis, about liver health, really thinking very closely about the words that are used to describe liver disease, including terms like fatty liver disease, and proposing other ways to describe that, give it another name that takes away the blame, the stigma, the shame of those kinds of diseases, and a whole lot of other things. So there's some terrific guidance in our journal, the International Journal of Drug Policy. So this was published just recently, I think 2024, asking us to consider very carefully the words that we use, because they reflect the norms that have been influenced by that overall arching framework of drugs as a serious evil. So this paper gives 5 things to think about and a number of sub-points within each of those 5 things. Highly recommend people to go and have a look at that paper. And of course, there are others in other areas. So again, in International Journal of Drug Policy, about the language used for people in prison. And there's just an amazing setup of this paper from a person who was formerly in prison, saying, when we are not called mad dogs, animals, predators, offenders, and other derogatory terms, we are referred to as inmates, convicts, prisoners, and felons, all terms devoid of humanness, which identify us as things rather than people. Those terms are accepted as the official language of the media, law enforcement, prison industrial complex, and public policy agencies. However, they are no longer acceptable for us, and we are asking people to stop using them. So that simple request, don't use that language, use language that positions us as humans, is a call for all of us to think carefully about the ways in which we use language in our own writing and presentations and mentoring of other people as you do in your own work, to really think carefully about the messages that you are sending by the language that we choose. And this is something that we will continue to need to focus on throughout our careers. It's not a set and forget. We are forever evolving in understanding the ways that our language shapes the world around us. So just wanting to put a few things out there to tune in people to think about language as such an important part of your writing journey. Over to you, Andrew.
Thanks for those wonderful sessions on writing a paper. And perhaps what we should have focused on also at the beginning is, why publish? And I think one of the questions came out in the discussion chat about this balance between advocacy and scientific writing. And I think it'll be good perhaps, Carl and Jason, for you to perhaps just briefly give your one reason why you think scientific publication is important. I think from my perspective, it's a key aspect to much of the advocacy we try to do, so that there's something to cite. But yeah, Carla, Jason, would you like to, reflect why you think it's important that people should invest this time, this heartache, this energy into publications?
Jason, do you want to go first?
You go ahead, Carla.
Yeah, heartache is a good word for it, Andrew. It's a hard slog, and rejection is the kind of baseline. So developing a thick skin and being able to respond to reviewers' comments with in the spirit that they may have been intended. But why publish? I think we're all in this field to do some good in the world, and everything that I think we publish, we're trying to advance a cause of better treatment, promoting the rights and dignity of people who use drugs or people who are affected by hepatitis C, or whichever field that we are in. And each paper we produce is, to my mind, a step along that way on that larger project of, in lofty terms, to make the world a better place. There are transactional things as well, of course. This is the way we build careers. This is the way we generate income to do more work. And also it's a responsibility of receiving public funds is to distribute the learnings from the use of those funds. Jason, you might have other things to say.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. I think it certainly comes down to improving the health of people who use drugs. And I think, this is one mechanism by which we can document and share what works and why it works. And that can then be taken up by other programs, other individuals, to expand those things. It's a way that they can replicate by clearly describing what you've done and how you did it. It allows people to take those successful things and amplify them. And every piece of research just leads to more and more questions. So the job's never done. And I think it's allowing science to continue to evolve and for us to be innovative and to continue to improve on things. So yeah, it's pretty exciting. It's a pretty fun area. I couldn't pick another job, I must say. Pretty fun going to work every day.
Thank you. I know in many countries or places without all the resources that maybe they have in Australia or in other high income settings, it can be very difficult to translate even research that you've done to getting it published. And then often what happens is that even if the research is done, it doesn't get picked up. So often grey literature doesn't get picked up in systematic reviews. And so I think one of the other benefits for people who come from low and middle income contexts is by publishing it, you get it into the international arena, which is important for being included in understanding the global picture. I see that some of our slides are moving forward, but that's not so important at the moment. We'd just like to also open it up to see if people have any follow-up questions. I thank Carla and Jason for putting in responses as they've come up. I think also one thing, a note of caution, I've had this unfortunate experience and many other colleagues have, is sometimes an expectation of a senior author to be included as an author but have not met the responsibilities of authorship. And I think that can often happen. And as a early career researcher, you should be very careful not to be bullied into that position. And just remember that there are those guidelines that you can go to, and to ensure that authors have made those responsibilities. There is a lot of, it's an ethical obligation, but in many countries, part of people's academic career is based on the publication record of senior authors. And also there is a remuneration to academic institutions based on publication. So just a cautionary note of, look for support if you need to, but don't feel bullied in including authors, because there are very clear ethical guidelines that should be followed. It may not happen in other contexts, but in South Africa that does happen, unfortunately. Any other questions people might like to pose us, you can put them in the chat, or I don't know if our hand function is operational, Brooke, but it's good to have some other voices. We've got another 10, 15 minutes if people have any burning questions.
Yes, people should be able to put their hands up, I believe, or jump in
Great.
off mute.
Great, please do so. And also any feedback, as Brooke has mentioned, we would value that.
There was also a couple of questions that came through from Charles earlier on as well that I've popped into a direct message to you, Andrew, if you're able to see those. I'm unsure if they were answered in the chat. Maybe Charles, jump in if you have any.
Yeah, I've got them now, but Charles, if you'd like to, articulate them. One is around your question around guidance for writing a thesis by publication. And also there was a question about signing some kind of confirmation of meeting the authorship criteria as described by the ICJME.
Yeah, thanks, Andrew. Yeah, they were answered. So Jason answered it directly around the requirement to get a document signed, which I came across recently, and just helps the rigor, I guess, and the from the journal's point of view, and making sure that all the authors are fully understanding of their roles. And so it's a good thing. I just, because Jason was talking about it, it came to my mind, was all. And as for publication, yeah, I guess I'd be interested in what Carla thought about how a thesis might look. It looks quite different. When I see thesis by publication, I think all around the world, not everyone does it, but in Australia we do. It ends up making the thesis looks quite different compared to a thesis that's just got no publications in it. I just wondered whether Carla had any thoughts on that.
Make a thesis by publication makes it so much easier to examine, because the papers, if they're published, have already been subject to peer review by other people. But in what way, Charles, are you worried about it looking different, or what do you mean there?
Just the style of writing. When you see the chapters set out in a sort of standard thesis, there's a flow to it, whereas in the publications they tend to be a bit more truncated. And from my point of view, publications are great. Thesis by publication is great because you're advancing your career as you're going along. It's like a PhD in practice, which is quite helpful. But that was I was just thinking they look quite different, and just the way you would bookend or create your chapters around publications versus just doing it without publications. So it's a pretty loose question, Carla. Apologies.
I can see Jason's raised his hand too, so I'll say something and then Jason can jump in. Yeah, the bookending, Charles, we can talk offline. I've got a couple of really good examples of how people have done that in a qualitative conceptual thesis. And the introduction and the kind of concluding chapter is really important because you're trying to tell the story across a couple of different papers of the themes, the meta themes that you're exploring. Yeah. And it could be really at the kind of the high level ontological view, to just use that word for a second, of upending power relations in knowledge production or something. But the papers are about specific projects or specific analyses, but the overall project might be quite different, or have that overarching view.
And in fact, even say a literature review, as you'd normally do in a thesis, can look quite different if you do a systematic review or a scoping review.
Yeah.
Way of tackling that front bit of the thesis, just as another example. But yeah.
So I was just going to say, Charles, embrace the thesis by publication. Just as Carla was saying, it is such a great opportunity to allow your work to go through the washing machine of review, and it gets reviewed by a bunch of different people. You've had it reviewed by your supervisors, then you have it reviewed by your co-authors, then you have it reviewed by the reviewers. By the time it's like in published form, like Carla said, it's been through the ringer. So when it gets to the reviewer, it's in pretty polished shape, and they're kind of like, and what's he going to change at this point? It's already in press. And then really, then it, like Carla said, it's that introduction that becomes really important to how do you then tie everything together, and then the discussion reflecting on like, what does this mean for the future of this area as a whole? So it also makes your thesis writing so much easier, Charles, rather than trying to like rewrite something. So yeah, don't be scared of it. I think everyone's going to move to this pattern. I think the older, the traditional thesis style is gone, with the exception of some kind of universities that might be trying to hold on to it. But I think most progressive places will push forward. And even then, Charles, it's not like I wouldn't suggest, the one thing I wouldn't suggest doing is I would not suggest like copying and pasting the articles into your thesis. It's still kind of a copy and paste of the text. And I would even go so far as to saying that if there was changes made to the proofs after, from the point it was submitted to the point that it was in print, you make those changes to your text in your submitted copy and paste of your thesis into the thing, because then you will get asked by your thesis examiners to like edit stuff. And if you have like a copy and paste of the papers in there, it's a nightmare, because then you're having to say, oh, on page blah blah blah, I want to change this sentence to this, versus if you just have your thesis copied and pasted in those chapters, those publications, then you just do track changes and you just edit the changes that way. So I hope that's helpful, Charles, and also happy to chat outside of this session.
Thanks.
Thanks. I'm going to bring us back to the focus. Sorry, Charles, to papers more broadly and not around the PhD by publication, but please follow up offline. I think there's a very good question that's been posed about working with community members and getting them involved as authors, posed by Matt Southwell. Matt, I don't know if you want to, articulate it. You also made reference to a previous experience in your career when you worked with someone who helped you or worked with you on a paper, and then we can get some perspectives on that. I think it's very relevant.
Cool. Yeah, happy to share. So yeah, I one of my very early experience, because I'm not someone who has an academic background at all, but I'm, obviously as a drug user activist, starting to work more and more with academic partners, recognizing the power that research has for us when we're advocating for guideline development, given all the sort of rigorous process by which WHO and EU Drugs Agency and other guidelines are set. So I think, as drug user activists, we're increasingly welcoming of trying to broker academic engagement with our community, where we see it having a really powerful advocacy benefit. And an early paper I was involved in was with Sam Friedman. It was a conceptual paper on harm reduction perspectives from the left, and he chose the rating given to the co-authors based on how much we'd contributed to the discussion. And because I'd been active, it gave me a reasonably higher rating among the co-authors, which was then validating of my contribution. And it also told me that Sam was a fair player, and that collaborating with him in future would be something that I'd be happy to do. And my question to the panelists was really just around when you're working with community members who've been those sort of brokers or peer researchers or played work roles with you, how do you think those people should be reflected in the paper development? And then also us understanding that you have needs as academics around different citation levels. How do you think those community members should be reflected as co-authors?
Great. Jason and Carla, would you like to give your thoughts, and then I'll give mine?
Sure. I've had I think we're all learning. That's the one thing I would say. And so I think my approach has changed over time, Matt. I was really fortunate. I learned a lot from one of my mentors, Jude Byrne. And Jude provided me with a lot of sort of insight into how we could do some of this stuff better. We had lots of chats about this. One of the things I've tried to do, and again, I don't think I have it totally nailed, but I think as I kind of elaborated, I think creating spaces that allow for kind of input beyond this, like send around a Word document and comment on the Word document. So I think, having, space to discuss this sort of the concept development early on, having people involved in the concept sheet design, sending that around, but having a Teams meeting to discuss it, and rather than trying to get commenting on Word, have that one-on-ones if that works better for that person rather than being in a group. But yeah, I think we did that a lot, particularly for the Tempo pilot paper that we wrote around point of care testing in collaboration with NUA. Again, holding kind of meetings, discussing the results as a group and as a team, and then integrating those comments, and then even sitting through the discussion and being like, what do you think? And co-writing pieces of it together, I've found has worked as well with community collaborators. So yeah, Carla, I don't know.
Yeah, I think that creating space, and the space doesn't have to be the same each and every time. I think a good researcher should look for different types of ways to work and different kinds of contributions that are significant and powerful. And I've done some work with Aboriginal communities and researchers, Aboriginal community members and Aboriginal researchers in Australia. And one paper, my Aboriginal mentor gave me one word, and it totally changed the conceptualization of the paper. Just one word. And besides, she loves to correct my grammar, so I love that about her. But that one word was when I said it was about colonisation as a big event in alcohol and other drug use in Australia. And I'd written something like the majority culture, blah, 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 meaning white Australians. And she, with her red pen on a piece of paper, wrote the now majority culture. And it was just so powerful to go, yep, I totally get what she's saying. And it totally changed the rest of the writing. So she could have written that in red pen, or she could have sat me down with a coffee underneath the lovely tree in her backyard, and she could have taught me through it. It doesn't matter. All of those spaces, all of those methodologies are equally valid, but it's that active process of engaging and listening and making space and suspending for a moment, at least, the kind of academic meal of I've got to publish, I've got to publish, I've got to publish, to sit and listen, engage authentically. And it doesn't matter what format that it is in. It's the sharing of expertise and building something that's better than what you had is the key focus.
And I just want to quickly jump in, and I don't know, Charles, if I don't know, put you on the spot, because just for those that you don't know, I've actually collaborated with Charles before on a paper recently. So I don't know, Charles, if you have any thoughts, but I think the one thing that's tricky that that trust is hard, and that kind of is really important, I think, at the beginning when you're working with someone. And yeah, it is hard because I think that trust is needed there. I don't know, Charles, if you have any thoughts or reflections. I know you put a comment down there as well, but
I just think the key thing is to not let kind of the intellect get in the way of the work. When you're working with community, make sure you're coming from the heart and talking, just as Carla said, just listening and receiving and making sure that everything is being understood the way, through watching and listening rather than trying to guide and direct. Try and let yourself go with the flow a little bit. And I think it's also really important the academic ideas need to go to community at inception, at the start,
sure.
not when you've kind of got a bit of an analysis or a rough plan together. That rough plan is going to be way better taken up by community if that rough plan is created together from the very start. And that's where the buy-in happens. I'd say the same to a GP when they're giving out OTP. If you just got to embrace that partnership and make sure that you're not fucking with those dynamics as they were.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Charles. Okay, Andrew, back to you.
So I think what comes out clearly is that it's a equal partnership, Matt, and it may be quite difficult for someone to take a first author traditional writing role, but if there's someone who has that interest, I think we've seen that people should be provided that opportunity and supported. And the other important mechanism is using the acknowledgement section in the paper to acknowledge if there are people who were involved very importantly in the project and the process, but may not have met all the criteria for authorship. That's an important thing not to forget. I mean, I've recently made the mistake of the acknowledgement section was in my draft, and in the final draft it got dropped, and then inadvertently many people who were involved were not included. But I think we should never underestimate the importance of acknowledging people who've put in input. It's really, really critical. Some really useful guidance of using innovative ways to engage with people throughout the process. And for people from the community, the traditional approaches of, circulating a document are often not very good ways of receiving meaningful input. We're coming to the end. I thought just in closing, we would recap on a few. Carla, Brooke, could you advance the slide for me? It doesn't allow me at the moment. Just to re-emphasize some key things that it's important to just go back one slide, please. That writing does take time, and it's important, as we heard, to plan appropriately. You should also be clear on why you're publishing, and that may influence what you write, how you write, and where you submit. Once you have made a decision, it's important to follow the directions very clearly. Jason did highlight that it's frustrating to an editor or when things are provided without following detail. But similarly, if the guidance isn't followed, it will make your submission process much longer than necessary because it'll be rejected for things that can be avoided. It's useful to have very clear the idea of the main messages, and I think that applies for the quantitative and the qualitative concepts so that you don't get lost in the weeds and are really able to focus on the most important things. The peer review process is an important one, and be aware to be responsive to the comments received. We didn't go into the peer review process, but I think as an early researcher, one thing I often grappled with was to respond to the reviewers' comments rather than to make the change in the document. And I think that's an important thing for people to always be aware of, is that the reviewer is highlighting things that's not clear to a reader, and to remember to change the document so that other readers don't have that same problem. And then you can respond to the reviewer in addition. It's useful to rewrite, and improve the sharpness of your work. And in the qualitative perspective, I think to give better descriptions and a thicker understanding of the nuance and the detail of what you're writing about. And I think we've emphasized that it is a long process, but don't get discouraged. And it is very rewarding to have your work in print. And I think it does some things do get easier, but it always a new paper and a new process with new partners and new issues. Then just next slide, please, when we talk about the EMCR group, if people are not members, just to raise your awareness of this special interest group of INSU. There are always activities that take place at the main conference, but also outside of the conference. It's an opportunity to network, an opportunity to participate in webinars and other innovative things that the group does get involved in. So we encourage you to join and become an active member. And also, it provides an opportunity to learn more about the network and to become more involved for the future. So then just thank you very much on behalf of myself, Jason, Carla, and Brooke for taking part, and we will share the presentations and the online recording. Yeah, thank you, and we hope to see you in Cape Town soon. Thanks again. Bye.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you all.